Okay, is this working? Is this working? Okay, good. Ross stepped away from the podium. I'm going to hang on to it for dear life because it is kind of scary, but it's also very important. All of you know that this past year has been a very difficult one for all of us who view diversity and equity as core values. For those of us who believe not only in respecting differences, but in celebrating them, who believe in justice and fairness, and who hold dear the idea that all men and women were created equal, and they should have equal opportunities to achieve their chosen goals and to contribute to society. I have to acknowledge that it's been an especially rough one for African American young men and women. They saw their peers gunned down on the street or stopped by a police on college campuses for, well, walking while black on a college campus. And who also saw on video in living color their white peers singing on a bus, not only using the N-word, but alluding to lynching as somehow appropriate. It's also been a difficult year for those of us from other groups who have also historically experienced oppression. For women who still are subjected to men in power discussing their bodies and their rights as if they weren't autonomous beings. For Muslims who watch their peers at UNC killed. For Jewish students who read about a peer at UCLA having her fitness for serving on student government challenged simply because of her faith. Many of you are probably aware that today is Holocaust Remembrance Day, and we must remember and learn. Prejudice, discrimination, stereotypes, and the dehumanization that they breed can lead to things that may seem unimaginable. We must remember. And we've had some incidents much closer to home, like the racial epithets that were hurled at our own students who were marching to make sure we all understood that Black lives matter. We are not immune. Here in the Pacific Northwest at the UW, we like to think of ourselves as progressive on these issues, but we often fall short of our ideals. This is not someone else's problem. And while I'm not any more sure of the solution than anyone else, I know the best way to get out of a hole is to stop digging. We may not be able to solve racial inequity and all those other forms of isms everywhere in the country or in the world. I'm not that naive. But we've got to begin by not being part of the problem. And we can only do that by recognizing it and acknowledging that it resides in us. That's why, though I'm a little scared, and I know that this is risky, we need to have this discussion, and we need to take action. So I'm going to share with you some very personal reflections and experiences, including my own encounters with prejudice. I share these knowing full well that I benefited from significant privilege. I came from a family that was highly educated, and I have light skin. I am privileged. I also want to share some observations about this generation of students, your generation, including some that I've experienced as a teacher in my 28 years here, in the classroom with you, beside you. But as important, I'm going to challenge all of us, students, faculty, my staff, my leadership team, to own both our personal responsibility for the culture of our campus and the institutional challenges which persist here and throughout our society. We're going to begin that work in the small group discussions at your table after my remarks, but that's not where it will end. Many of you have already begun the work. You've organized and participated in teach-ins with our faculty. You've held rallies and marches. You're serving on working groups and task forces addressing everything from wage disparity to barriers to access, and many other factors that lead to racial and societal inequity. Just the fact that you're here today tells me that you're concerned and that you're committed to justice. So before we start, let's remember that societal justice isn't a destination, a problem that can be solved in a one-and-done manner. It's a struggle. You keep at it. You keep working. Sometimes you falter. I'm sure I will as I talk, but you push ahead. We're here at the University of Washington. We stand on Duwamish land in a part of the world that's known for its biodiversity. Rainforests and deserts, glaciers and gorges, eagles and goldfinches. A place where you can dig for oysters and geoducks, grow apples and tulips. And we know that it's that diversity that makes this region so special, so beautiful, so inspiring. Look outside, what a gift of a day. Some of you probably chose to pursue your degrees here at the UW because you believed you would find support, feel safe, and be accepted for who you are, where you would be buoyed by a set of policies and procedures that would allow that to happen, and by a set of peers that would welcome you. The National Study of College Freshmen, which is conducted at UCLA, it's been conducted for over a decade, has been tracking the attitudes of college students nationwide. And it found that your generation of students views itself as committed and comfortable with diversity. More than 80% of this year's freshmen said that their ability to work with peers of different cultures and races was either somewhat strong or a major strength. Your generation clearly knows and seems to embrace that diversity is important to learning and to preparation for success in a global society, in a global marketplace. So then, why has so much violence and ugliness been happening on college campuses? Maybe part of the answer lies in another question in the study. On that question, only about 45% of all freshmen believed that knowledge of other cultures or races was even somewhat important. I think these two seemingly incompatible beliefs, embracing diversity but not really claiming knowledge of other cultures, emerge side by side because yours is a generation raised on the notion that we can be colorblind, or culture blind, or gender blind. Raised to believe these things no longer matter. They were an issue long past. Or even worse, that the way to fix whatever bias or prejudice might still exist is to become willfully blind to it. You don't need to know about differences to work across them because they just don't matter. But is this blindness really a good thing? And whose color, gender, faith, or culture are we erasing when we go blind? What's being whitewashed, so to speak? I can remember being a brand new assistant professor. I just gave a colloquium focusing on youth of color. That's the group that I work with and study. And afterwards, one of my colleagues commented positively about my talk. And then he said to me, "You know, I've never thought of you as a Latina. You don't act like one." And this was clearly supposed to be a compliment. A compliment, I guess, to his enlightenment and to the fact that I talk real good. I felt like screaming, "What's the problem with being a Latina? Or acting like one, whatever that means." Why is that a problem? It's who I am. Why the heck should that be a problem? W.E.B. Du Bois, the first Black Harvard PhD, founder of the Niagara Group that laid the foundation for the NAACP, he's someone that I think of as my academic grandfather because he was my mentor's mentor, put it best in a very powerful book called The Souls of Black Folk. He said, "Being a problem is a strange experience, peculiar even for one who has never been anything else." So maybe it's time to reset the equation and admit that first, we're not colorblind, or should we be? And more importantly, that we cannot just escape our history and biases by pretending they don't exist or they're in the past. We have to begin by facing up to them. Racially based stereotypes, biased attitudes, and racist beliefs aren't things that reside solely in or are perpetuated by bad people. If they were, the solution would be easy. Get rid of those people, take the bad apples out of the barrel, and done. Problem solved. Sure, there are horrible bigots and people who spread hate, and the world would be a better place if we could stop them from doing so. But racism and all those other isms are inside all of us. And I don't just mean pale males. They're passed down over generation in our cultures and histories. They're imbibed by new immigrants as they arrive on our shores. But it's often subtle. Sometimes it's not even part of our own consciousness. That's why we have to actively struggle to get beyond it. We can't just will it or ignore it away. We have to become culturally aware and self-aware. Let's not forget that men, and they were all men, who wrote that all men are created equal, an extremely liberating and powerful idea that's made a real difference in the world. Nonetheless, when they said all men, they did mean all men, and they meant all white men. Many of them owned slaves. Racism was baked into our country's founding, and it remains in the fabric of our country, indeed, of every country that I know of. And it's there, underneath the surface of our daily lives. Sometimes racist remarks or actions are clearly willful, and they're meant to hurt, to put people in their place. But even a truly thoughtless, and I do mean thoughtless, without thought, comment, born out of ignorance, plain and simple, can still cause damage. The march organized by the Black Student Union and others to say Black Lives Matter marked a day full of pride for those who marched, and many of them marched right along with our students. It was probably the largest march since the 1970s. It was student-led, and it was peaceful, and it was life-affirming. Then somebody yelled out something about the demonstrators being apes, and they turned something joyous into something ugly. Words can damage. They may not break bones, but they can crush souls, which is worse. Now, it's pretty clear that those young men, the ones who shouted out apes, meant for their words to hurt. But words can hurt just the same if that isn't the intention. When I was teaching a class about intelligence testing not all that long ago in our clinical graduate program, I'm a psychologist, one of my mentees, an African-American young woman, very proudly told the class that the work on sequencing the human genome showed that the genetic overlap between races was 99.9%. And a young man in the class followed her comment by saying that the overlap between human and chimpanzees was 96%. Now that's true. In fact, the overlap with mice is 85%. But that was not the point. I knew this young man, and he was pretty clueless about what he just said, about how he'd indirectly made the comparison between African Americans and apes, a comparison with a long and difficult and tortured history, a history that still stings, and still has power. my student's face had fallen. He hadn't meant it that way, but the pain, the insult was still real. Cluelessness is not an excuse. Lack of knowledge about the histories and cultures of those different than ourselves, coupled with confidence that we can work with others of other races and cultures, are the perfect ingredient for a Molotov cocktail ready to explode at any minute. So we shouldn't be so surprised when it does. These clueless microaggressions, as researchers call them, as many of you have been talking about, as our ASCs have been talking about, add up because they're persistent and daily. And no, you can't just shake them off. And you shouldn't have to. One of the contexts for all this is that our neighborhoods and schools have become more segregated since the 1970s, since before Ross was born. We don't know much about difference because by and large we live in homogeneity, often based on class, but race and class in this country go hand in hand. College campuses like this are often the most diverse setting our students have ever been in. That's why it's the right place to change the equation. But that requires putting in the time to learn about others, to look inside ourselves, at our own upbringing, at what we heard our parents and our neighbors whisper, at what we've sometimes thought or felt before we've caught ourselves. Many of you know I was born in Cuba. And in Cuba, like most Caribbean countries, racism has its own distinct look and feel. Words that would sound racist in this country, like mi negrita, literally my little black one, are actually terms of endearment. But that doesn't mean that a color line doesn't exist, even though it might be placed in a slightly different part of the color spectrum. I learned from my parents that I was lucky to be light-skinned. My religious aunt, who went to Mass every day and who taught me compassion and charity, also taught me that white skin was a gift from God. So we should be extra kind to those who were darker. How incredibly condescending, how white of her. But they were good people, and I admire them, and I love them to this day. But still, they held beliefs that I won't sugarcoat by calling them anything other than racist. They weren't so good about gender equity either. They laughed at men who were effeminate, and by the way, they also thought Anglos had loose morals. Part of the reason why I wanted to go away to graduate school. But at least in this country, they had no power, so the effects of their biases didn't extend far. But knowing what I know about families and familial influence, it's what I study, not to mention all I know about larger societal context and how it affects us, in my most honest moments, I have to ask, how can these biases, these prejudices, this racism, not be a part of who I am? And because I am in a position of power, it can matter, and I must be self-aware, and you must hold me accountable. And so must you, since so many of you will leave here and go on to be leaders. What you believe, what you think, how you act will matter. I did try to bring my parents into the 20th century, and I had some success. But in many ways, I just ignored their prejudice until I couldn't. When I met the woman I thought would be my partner for life, and I was right, our 26th anniversary is coming up in about a month. Thank you. putting up with me is not easy. I so much wanted my mother to be part of our lives, which meant coming out to her. It wasn't something I looked forward to, but it had to be done. I expected my mother to be unhappy, but I couldn't have anticipated what she'd say. Now both my children are dead. Nothing could have been more hurtful. Her other child, my brother, her son was murdered. He was a civil rights activist and a union organizer. And when you try to organize black and white workers in some parts of the South, you run into the Klan. He helped to organize what was this country's first anti-Klan rally. The Klan showed up, and 5 young people were murdered. And even though it was the day before cell phones, the cameramen were there. It's on film. I've seen my brother get shot and die. He was 25, recently graduated, and newly married to a woman of Panamanian background who was black. There were many reasons why he was targeted, one of them because he was a race mixer. And it fell on me to tell my mother. I'll never do anything harder, and I'll never forget the sound she made. It wasn't human. It was unbearable for us both. So to have her equate what I just told her about me, about my happiness, to that moment, it was just plain cruel. But I knew she loved me. There was never a doubt. I knew how much she'd sacrificed to give me the life that I have. She even offered to sell her condo, her only real possession, to get me into conversion treatment. She thought that was a sign of love. What can I say? It was tough between us for a bunch of years. And then finally something changed. To this day, I'm not sure exactly how or what, but she was ready to visit me in our house. And she grew to love my partner, now spouse. Years later, trying to fight her way back from a massive stroke, my mother died in my arms. And I knew she was proud of me. And I hope she knew that I was proud of her. It was the last gift we gave each other. She was, this isn't about guilt. It's about change. She was a strong, wise, and compassionate person. At 4'11", though she would only agree that she was 5 foot, she was a Mack truck of persistence. But her life was steeped in racism, sexism, classism, and heterosexism. It's not about bad people doing bad things. It's about us. This is not someone else's problem. It's not about guilt. This is about change. This is about growth. Perhaps grudgingly, and I can tell you certainly it was an inch at a time, my mother did change. She opened her heart to her son's wife, who was black, and to her daughter's wife, who was, well, a wife. Although then she was a partner. And that not only made my life happier, and believe me, it did make my life happier, it made her life and her death a whole lot better. She could have spent the last decade of her life bitter and alone, and she could have died that way too. Prejudice and bias divides us from people. It's the opposite of that boundlessness that we talk about that's become our motto. Prejudice is all about binding and limiting. It makes us smaller. Now, please don't think I told this story because I expect any of the victims of oppression on our campus or in society to be as tolerant or loving towards those who seek to keep them down as I was towards my mother. She was, after all, my mother. She wasn't a colleague or a friend. much less a stranger. And I also don't mean to imply that through love, everyone changes or tries to change. Love isn't all we need. It's a good, but it's not all. And though I did help to educate my mother, I want to make clear it's not up to those in the oppressed groups to educate us and enlighten us. And when we allow those who are oppressed to struggle for equity alone, rather than struggling alongside, or serving as their allies, we're not only increasing their burden, we're giving them our burden to carry. We do not live in a colorblind society. And the fact that we'd even think that's desirable says something about how we really view difference. Believe me when I say that Black people in this country cannot forget that they're Black, especially on a primarily white campus, even more so when they're the only in a class or a club or. They know that if they do something wrong, they will be judged differently, and I mean that literally. Just look at our jails. Words don't break bones, they crush souls. Stereotypes may be all in your head, but they shape reality, and they create the conditions that lead others to break bones or burn crosses or murder. And this combination of words and stereotypes and biases create the conditions that lead to exclusionary or biased policies or institutional practices that lead to maintain racial and other forms of inequity and deny real people real opportunities. So, where does that lead us? I've spent the better part of our time talking about the personal consequences of discrimination and bias. But I'm even more concerned in my role as president about the effects of systemic or institutional racism, the barriers that diminish our capacity as a society, or in this case, as a university, to truly fulfill our public promise of both access and excellence. Indeed, of access to excellence. One of our alums, Nick Hanauer, a philosophy major and venture capitalist, those are not oxymorons, also a proponent of middle-out economics, captured it beautifully in, of all places, a Facebook rant. In it, he wrote, "Innovation is a combinatorial and cooperative process. Diversity is at the core of that process. Diversity supercharges innovation. Innovation happens when we bring new perspectives, ideas, experiences, and solutions to the table. Diversity drives excellence. We cannot be a truly great university without it. To make progress on solving the world's greatest challenges, we must also make progress on diversity." Universities are places of discovery, of civil discourse, of difficult conversations. Here's where we learn new ways of looking at the world, of acting in the world. So let's start the change here, right now. Because if not here, where? So how? I don't have all the answers, surprise, but let me suggest at least a few things, and you'll be suggesting many more. First, refuse to be a part of it. Call out your friends who tell racist jokes or who make biased assumptions about people of color or women or the undocumented or. Tell them it's not funny, that what they're saying is offensive, that you won't be a party to it. If you must, walk away. This is especially important if you're in the mainstream or majority, because we can't just shift the burden to speak out onto the aggrieved party. It's not their problem, and when they say something, it's often viewed as defensive or personal, and that's not what it's about. If you're told by someone Asian or in a wheelchair or gay, that what you've said is hurtful or insensitive, a simple "I don't mean it" doesn't cut it. That just makes it all about you and what you meant, when they had the courage to tell you how they feel at a very difficult moment. Better is "I'm sorry, I was insensitive, I won't do it again," and then don't do it again. Second, learn about others that are different than you, partly through human contact, but also, guess what? There's reading and education. We have courses here. We do. If you're not sure why your words were offensive or hurtful, and sometimes that will be the case, put in the time and energy to analyze and problem solve it on your own time. Educate yourself. Don't expect others to do it for you. And you know, when you say something dumb, it's usually not that hard to figure it out. Just talk to a few friends. It's not rocket science. Third, take the time for self-reflection and self-examination. I'm a psychologist, of course I'd say that, but it's true. Look into your hearts and into your heads and analyze what's there. Don't let it scare you. Whether you're black or white or brown, you do have racial or gender or other stereotypes and biases and prejudice, sometimes even about your own group. It's impossible to live in this society without them. Knowing this will help you catch yourself and not act on them, which is what's really important. Having a stray thought is very different from acting on it. And with time and effort, habits and thought patterns can and do change. You can get past your biases and really connect as equals and make your world bigger and truly boundless. And your change can lead to a world of change for our community, for all our community. It's not just what we do individually, it's also what we do collectively. There was a recent article in the New York Times about a neuroscientist who was investigating the roots of prejudice. And it notes that we've been shaped to wear seatbelts, some of you may remember before seatbelts, to recycle, to pick up dog doo, to eat vegetables. But, and I'm quoting, "What has not come so easily is persuading us to identify with or even tolerate people we perceive as outsiders." The killing of a single unarmed black teenager might prompt thousands to protest in the streets, but social policies that address the problem behind individual fates, programs to combat poverty or racial bias in policing, remain as polarizing as ever. What we need to do is hard. So my last point today is to ask you to share my commitment and that of all my colleagues throughout the university's leadership to work in greater and more comprehensive ways to strive for equity for all in our community. We must take that challenge on. We're still working on and figuring out what this Race and Equity Initiative, at least that's what we're calling it right now, will look like and what the different steps will be. But in many ways, we've already started, you've already started. We're following the lead of our students who said loud and clear that Black Lives Matter, and of our faculty who immediately organized a teach-in, and of the staff at OMAD who's already been working on a new diversity blueprint and has initiated a series of community conversations to learn how to better support the communities we serve. Some of the pieces of the initiative will include a review and implementation of recommendations from the Bias Response Task Force, who've been asked to examine how we might improve UW's ability to receive and respond to incidences of bias and discrimination. It will also involve work we do with our faculty search committees to make sure that members know how implicit bias can interfere with what we like to think of as a meritocratic hiring process. This isn't my initiative, it's your initiative, it's our initiative. Together, we will, we can. We don't have all the solutions, and I'm not naive enough to think we're going to solve the problems of prejudice, hatred, bigotry, or ethnic conflict here and now. But we can, right here, right now, pledge to stop being a part, or at least not so much a part of the problem, to find our better selves, to build bridges across our differences instead of erecting walls or ignoring them. My friend and colleague Eric Liu, founder of Citizen University, who's written several books including A Chinaman's Chance, loves to point to a billboard he saw on a busy highway. It said simply and powerfully, "You aren't in traffic, you are traffic." We are the problem, and we're the only ones who can change it. So let's begin to acknowledge our shortcomings and talk about them. Not about them in other people and those bad apples and those, few racist folks out there, but in ourselves, in our workplaces, in our living places, in the places we study and learn. Let's talk about how we can hold ourselves and our friends accountable, about how we can change, about how we can take action, right here, right now. Let's begin today, because if not here, where? Thank you.